2 o'clock, Ethel. I think perhaps we can start.
Sure, Yolanda.
Yeah, I'm just conscious that we have an hour, so I think we need to start promptly.
Yep.
Okay.
You are on mute, Yolanda. Sorry. Yeah, good. I've just unmuted you.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're well. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. My name is Yolanda Moyo. I'm the Senior Director for Policy Advocacy at IAVI. It is my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the organizers and hosts, IAVI, Wits University Reproductive Health HIV Institute, Wits RHI, and the HIV AIDS Vaccine Ethics Group, HAVEG, from the UKZN, University of KwaZulu-Natal. This webinar is made possible by our funders AVAC and USAID. We are grateful for the support that they give us to do this important work. And we are all very excited to have this opportunity to discuss a very important topic, understanding the ethics review processes in the context of vaccine clinical trials, with a particular focus on COVID-19 and HIV vaccines, with our distinguished panel of speakers. The webinar itself is going to be structured in the following way. I'll give an overview of the session, outlining the objectives and what we hope to achieve at the end of the session. And I'll then introduce the speakers. They'll have brief presentations of about 5 minutes each. And then after each presentation, we're going to allow questions just to clarify anything that was misunderstood. And then we would like to have a question and answer session after all our panelists have given their presentations. And then hopefully at the end, we'll give summary and wrap up. So the overview of today's session, really, we all understand that vaccine development is quite complex. And vaccines in themselves are crucial in the arsenal of biomedical tools that we need to halt a rapidly spreading disease during a pandemic. And we know that on the continent, currently there are vaccine trials that are underway for COVID-19, HIV, and other infectious diseases. And many of these trials are collaborations between the Global North and South organizations. And we would like to also acknowledge that, you know, it's important for Africa to be part of these clinical trials, but understanding that Africa is a huge continent, it is not homogeneous, it's very diverse in terms of its population, culture, ethics, review processes, and not only these differences within the continent, but also differences between the global north and and south, which often creates quite complex ethical dilemmas. So we need to have a timely conversation and timely attention to these differences, which are key to ensuring that ethical review processes and trial conduct meet both international and local needs, particularly in the context of vaccine trials being developed during a pandemic. And we've heard from advocates, we've heard them ask the questions, we've heard them share their concerns, particularly around provision of trial information in an understandable format, minimizing coercion in low resource settings where poverty is rife and access to healthcare is inequitable and quite often very expensive. We've also heard concerns around oversight of ethics committees themselves and unclear processes for accountability in case of failures or omissions by ethics committees. And we've also heard that whilst we must innovate, and we must innovate in circumstances such as this one we're facing globally of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it's important that as scientists grapple with understanding the coronavirus SARS-CoV-2 and also trying to save lives at the same time, that we maintain high ethical standards in the process. So what we want to achieve from this workshop is to highlight the role of ethics committees in protecting the public from harm and unethical vaccine research, and also in making sure that there's meaningful stakeholder engagement in vaccine trials, and also hearing from our panelists who will give us insights of what the responsibilities of researchers are, and also the role that advocates play. Not just advocates, but also communities at large in this regard. So before we start, I would like to just go through Zoom etiquette or ground rules, as we say. I'm sure most of you are familiar with these now, with a lot of webinars that we've been attending, but just for the purposes of this webinar, I just wanted to go through a few housekeeping details. Ethel, please share the slide. Okay, so what we'll ask is that if you are not speaking, please remain muted. I think most of you are muted anyway. We will unmute you if you are selected to speak. If you'd like, you can use the option to raise your hand, which is the icon that's found on the lower right hand of your screen. And please do wait for the moderator to grant you the permission to speak, to unmute before you speak. And we would like to make sure that you remain audible. So just do a sound check before you continue, so that we make sure we understand and hear you. And also you could use the chat option for asking clarifying questions and address your issue to a specific panelist or speaker. The meeting is an hour, so we're going to be very strict on time. For our speakers and also for asking questions. So please be brief in asking your question. And yes, so we hope that this is going to be a fun learning experience for all of us, and that we'll all come away a lot more knowledgeable at the end of the session. So without further ado, I would like to present our panelists. I will introduce them by name and institution that they're affiliated to. Granted that they all wear different hats at different times, but for the purposes of today's webinar, I'll introduce them with respect to the role that they play in the ethics review processes. The first panelist to introduce is Professor Elizabeth Bukusi, who's the chair of the bioethics, and Dr. Mantoa Mahashani from Wits University Research Ethics Committee, and Professor Sarah Edwards and Dr. Blessing Silingwana from Pandora, and John Bosco Marahiha, a community representative from Uganda Virus Institute of Science and Ethics Committee. Our speakers will highlight the role of the ethics review processes, and the first speaker to present would be Professor Elizabeth Bukusi. Please, over to you, Professor Bukusi.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege for me to be able to talk with you briefly this afternoon. And I want to just briefly share about what ethics review processes do, ensuring that communities and participants are safe when we're conducting clinical trials. And for example, when we're conducting trials that involve trials of vaccines. Now, we know that those of us in Africa, we do have a large burden, global burden of disease. And the common ones we think about all the time are HIV, TB, malaria. And there's been a concern that increasingly, because of costs and other reasons, that a lot of work is done in low resource setups to ensure that people can find biomedical interventions that are useful. And of course, the current thing that we're focusing on is thinking about the COVID-19 vaccine. And the concern people always raise is there a potential that people could be exploited, especially those who might be vulnerable? I think it's always important to remember that any drugs, any biological products, any vaccines, all of these things have to be tested in some way through some kind of clinical trials, some kind of research before it can be used, so that we know it's safe, so that we know it does actually work. The challenge, however, is that we need to ensure that this research is done ethically and that it is done in a very responsible manner. Let me talk a little bit about some of the limitations that probably our current regulations face. There are many national guidelines, apart from the international ones that I won't really touch on, but many of our national guidelines, they emphasize issues around individual rights, which are very important. However, they don't really think about human relationships, the ties that are found within families and communities. Another thing they don't address as strongly and as well is often thinking about licensure, affordability. What happens after the research is done and we show that something does work? How do we ensure that the communities in which this research was done are able to participate from it? So what's the role of the Ethical Review Committee and what do they do? Really, they have a balancing act. And what do they need to do in the process of this balancing act? They need to do what we're calling a risk-benefit analysis. First of all, the research must be sound from a scientific perspective. If it is not sound, then we're wasting resources, we're wasting people's time and effort, and if we will not yield any results that can be useful, then that is morally wrong. But apart from the fact that the research should be done appropriately and that the research is robust, the question is, what's the benefit versus the risk? And in the process, ensuring that there is potential for benefit and a reduced potential for harm. We do need to make sure that individuals as well as the communities are respected, meaning they have the opportunity to have input to indicate they would want to be part of the research. They have an opportunity to understand what are they participating in and to appropriately give consent. And then for justice, we need to ensure that indeed, if this product is going to be useful, that there is a way that they could benefit from it. Those are critical things that any research review process must look at. We do need to ensure, however, that there's more responsibility towards communities, that we can consult, not just when we are ready to do the research, but when we're developing protocols that will be put in for research, that we involve communities in the process of the consenting, we partner with them when we're doing the research, and that we ensure that after the research is completed, there is a way in which those communities can access the products of that research, especially with regards to things like costs. And we need to ensure that we are applying appropriate guidelines to involve the community and to engage them at every point. If we do not do research, however, we will not find solutions and we will not be able to make a difference in the world and be able to stop pandemics like the one that we're currently facing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Bukusi. Are there any clarifying questions before we move on to our next speaker?
Either I was very clear or I confused everybody and nobody wants to ask me anything.
That's all right. Maybe they're saving their questions for the Q&A. So that's okay. Thank you so much. And I really like, how you say it's a balancing act between risk and benefit. And that's really so important to highlight. Someone is asking if we'll have access to the slides. Yes, you will. Our next speaker will be Dr. Mantoa Mahashani from the Wits Research Ethics Committee. Please go ahead. Please go ahead, Mantoa.
Yes, I'm trying to share. It's now complaining. It's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. Maybe you'll
Oh
just have to
dear.
share from your side.
Yes.
Okay.
Ethel, please assist us.
Okay, I'll just, sorry about the slight transfer delay. I am getting the slide open. These things know when to.
Yeah, it worked when we were
Machines,
testing it.
I know,
It's
machines are really strange things. They know exactly when to distress you, but never mind. We are on now. There we are.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful for this opportunity. I'm just going to concentrate mainly on our experience here at Wits and not talk about all the other things. And I think Professor Bukusi has already mentioned some of the things, so there is no point in going over that again. Can I have the next slide? So the ethics committees in South Africa reviewed existing national guidelines when COVID hit our country. So they saw that there was a clause that actually enabled to accelerate research during an emergency. So they used that, and our ethics chairs all over the country, and with all the ethics committees, they have meetings regularly. They also decided to have an informal peer support system empowering the research ethics committees. So if, for instance, you've received a proposal or a research proposal, and there are things that you're not clear about, or you want a second opinion from another research ethics committee, they then send it to other people and get responses within 24 hours. But in our own ethics committee at Wits, we have a subcommittee for COVID-19 research expedited reviews. But if there are concerns, then it's brought to the larger committee. We've got members of about 32, 33 in our committee. Thank you. Next slide. And we really adhere to guidelines. This is the checklist that we use to actually make sure that every document has been submitted to us. Next slide. So for the initial vaccine that we tested, the Wits Oxford Coalition, I actually also even spoke to the researcher himself, the lead researcher, to find out what his experience was from the ethics committee. So it was approved by 2 ethics committees, the South African Health Product Regulatory Authority, as well as the Wits Human Research Ethics Committee. There was also the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, who approved the import of the investigational vaccine for use in the trial. And the experience that we had, he said he had, is that within 10 working days he got the initial review and the final approval within 20 days. Thank you. Next slide. They started first with communities. As it was mentioned by the previous speaker, it's important to involve communities from the beginning. We tend to go ahead with the research and want the communities to just jump on board, but we need to actually start with them. So they do have a community advisory board as well as NGO coalitions who actually also chose who they bring to the meetings. So they had online meetings and all types of meetings which could actually be allowed during the COVID limitations or restrictions. Next slide. So with the North-South coalition, Wits and Oxford, they share data of Data and Safety Monitoring Board. And we've already completed the recruitment. They were going to do 2,000, but the researcher just said now they've completed with 1,500 participants. The studies occurred concurrently because we were trying to avoid the South leg lagging behind. and Wits is using their own laboratories. It's not this thing where we'll be shipping documents to other places, and they also own the data. Next slide. This week we started with the second vaccine, Novavax, evaluating safety, immunogenicity, and efficacy. Recruitment started on Monday. The target is about 2,904 participants. There are 2 arms, healthy HIV negative participants and also medically stable HIV positive participants. Next slide. Here, I'm not going to be talking much, but I just want to bring it to everyone's attention that it's always a problem, especially for us in Africa, because we do not have the resources. We may get involved in research, but when it's time for post-trial access, we have to be fighting. I would suggest that researchers, every time when they enter in these coalitions, they should be discussing vaccine access post-trial, as well as the communities. They should be asking those questions. They shouldn't be afraid to ask those questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think that was really enlightening. And this issue of post-trial access is really quite a contentious issue. And I think advocates have a very, very important role to play there. I'd like to now invite John, Mr. John Bosco Barahika. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, John. We would like to hear from you from the perspective of a community representative within the ethics committee. Because quite often we always imagine that the ethics committee is composed of scientists, and we have concerns about, who brings the voices of communities in those platforms. So I think, John, you've had quite an interesting experience of being part of the ethics committee, and would like to hear from you in terms of how community voices are represented. So over to you, John.
Thank you. Nice to hear from you. The community's perspective usually is presented by community representatives on ethics committees. And usually we go by the set standards of the committees, and also we ensure that the participants are not harmed in any way. So we look at the documents being presented, especially when it comes to consenting the communities. Then we look at the appropriateness of the researchers, their CVs and the related experience in that field. So after we ensure that the documents being presented, like the consent forms, the consent process, how long is the consent process, and how it is being done. Then we also look at the recruitment, ensuring that the rights of the rights and the well-being of the participants is not compromised. We also check how the researcher intends to work with the communities where the research is being intended to be done. Once we are satisfied that that is okay, then the other experts can also confirm whether the science is okay, because it is also very good to see the justification of the study being done. And sometimes we find that some researchers just ignore that aspect of involving the community in the other initiation of the studies, but we make sure that there are means of involving the community at all stages.
Thank you so much, John. That's interesting experience from a community member within the ethics committee. Without further ado, I think I'll ask Blessing and Professor Sarah Edwards to give us their perspectives on this topic. Please go ahead. I think you're doing a tag team, the two of you, so please go ahead.
Thanks. Blessing, I think you're going to take over from here, aren't you?
Hi, Blessing, we can't hear you. Are you on mute?
Yolanda, hi, can you see my slide? I was just asking you to confirm if you can see my slides.
Yes, yes, we can see your slide. Please go ahead.
Blessing, we're having trouble hearing you.
Blessing, we can't hear you. Please go ahead. Can you say something so we can see if you're audible? I think Blessing mentioned that he was using his phone, so the connection might be a bit unstable. Sarah, would you mind presenting on behalf of Blessing?
Yes, I'd be happy to take you through a few of the points. Although I have to confess that that Blessing has very kindly put the slides together, so I wasn't entirely sure what he was planning to say. I know that he's got much more experience of the South African ethics committees, but what I can perhaps tell you about is some of the work that we're doing as a consortium. Sorry, you might want to see me as well, I don't know, I'm here. Hello.
Hello, good to see you. Go ahead.
As a consortium, we're working with the EDCTP and the African CDC to encourage or at least support and facilitate research during epidemics across the continent. And a few, we've been running for about 2 years already. So we've seen a couple of emergencies already, although of course not the scale of this pandemic that we're facing right now. But some of the work that we've been doing prepares us nicely for some of the debates that we're now facing, particularly in relation to the situation with vaccine trials in South Africa. So one of those issues related to what seemed to be sort of purely operational concerns. And with WHO Afro, during the 9th outbreak of Ebola in the DRC, the Central African countries got together to try and work through some ways in which research and approval for research could be speeded up without any compromise to the existing integrity of the ethics review and regulatory processes. And the sort of, to cut a long story short, the conclusion was that ethics committees just weren't happy in pre-approving any protocol. So researchers were very keen, understandably, to be able to get all the paperwork approved in advance, perhaps with generic details that could be sort of whittled down to provide the detail necessary at the time.
Hello, Yolanda, can you hear me?
Hello, Blessing. Yes.
Hi, Blessing. Yes,
I'm
we
so
can
sorry.
hear you.
I'm really struggling with my mobile device. Can you hear me and you see my slide, please?
Yes. We can both see your slides and hear you. I'll just quickly finish what I was just saying, and then hopefully hand over to you completely. So the ethics committees dug their heels in, which was a marvellous reflection of how they valued the whole process of ethics review, and felt that the only compromise to having a full review at the time would be to have sight of information beforehand, but they would still want to see the full applications at the time in which the research was being proposed, and immediately before recruitment would be encouraged, or at least supported. So that really goes to show that the ethics committees had a very, very strong voice, and got together with the regulators and helped shape the framework for standard operating procedures for reviewing research during the sorts of emergencies that we were facing in the DRC with Ebola and the vaccine trials that were going on there. The other issues are substantive ones, and I think that Blessing is probably better placed to take you through those, because he very skillfully facilitated some workshops we were organising through the African CDC to solicit values and beliefs from members of ethics committees around the continent, with a view to developing a continent-centric framework, instead of simply trying to adopt international guidelines which may be in conflict with each other. So rather than simply implement something that's being developed elsewhere and something being lost in translation, the idea, and it's still in progress, is to develop a sort of a continent-wide accepted set of principles and values, yet acknowledging that it's such a diverse and large continent that we can't automatically assume that, well, to coin the phrase, one size will fit all. We just don't know whether that would be possible, and that's one of the things that that we're seeking to find out. Okay, Blessing.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, so as Sarah have already indicated, we did a consultative series of workshop with African RIC members, and this was facilitated by Pandora and the African CDC. So I want to quickly, I'm just gonna skip over the other slides now because of time, and I want to quickly go on to some of the key findings that emerged from this consultative workshop that we had with RICTs. So there were a range of issues really that we discussed, and I'm just going to try and share some of those key issues that came out of those discussions. So the first sort of important issue that was discussed by the participants was around the concept of social value. And this was seen as one of the key ethical requirements that, particularly for the COVID-19 vaccine trials, which obviously involve a lot of players, some international collaborators from the global north. The issue of social value was one requirement that RICs would want to see in proposals for COVID-19. And really the notion behind this social value concept is that any research that is being done should be of relevance to the local population and should address local health needs. And obviously the community or the population from which research participants are drawn should stand to benefit from the research. So in other words, a research study that proposes to do a vaccine trial, yet in Africa or in a particular community in Africa, yet there is no benefit derived from that from the clinical trial, would definitely be regarded as unethical from the standpoint of this social value aspect. Another interrelated issue that came up was the issue of collaborative partnerships. So this really entailed ensuring that in international research initiatives between the global north and the global south, there has to be equitable, determining of research agendas and fair responsibilities between researchers in the developed countries and researchers in the developing countries. And this also entailed, engaging respectful, in respectful community engagement with local communities in order to better understand their values, their cultures, and to also respect those cultures and those values.
Yes.
So another issue that came up also was the issue of fair selection of participants who are going to take part in clinical trials. Again, considering that most of the clinical trials, particularly for COVID-19 vaccine trials, there's a lot of collaboration that's going on. And so the issue here is that participants should not be selected because of their low socioeconomic status, which is the case in Africa generally, but they should be really selected based on the objectives of the research study. So in other ways, there should be a fair distribution of the burdens and benefits of participating in research. Another important issue that was discussed by the participants was obviously the issue of ensuring that any research proposal should have a favorable risk-benefit ratio. In other words, there should be efforts by the RICs or by the researchers themselves to max or to minimize the risk to research participants and enhance the potential benefits to research participants and communities. Another important issue that was discussed also in this consultative forum was the issue of informed consent. This probably came out quite strongly and quite often, and RICs here were really saying that informed consent is a key requirement in any clinical trial, and there should be voluntary consent obtained prior to enrollment in any research. But of course, there were acknowledgements that in some circumstances, informed consent could be waived by RICs where obtaining such consent is not feasible. Lastly, I want to talk about the issue of ongoing respect for participants and communities. And this really entailed a lot of issues. So I think one of the issues that was mentioned by Professor Bukusi was the issue of, so what happens when participants participate in clinical trials? There were a lot of views from RIC members on the need to ensure post-trial access to vaccines and rewards that come from participating in trials. So once the trial is over, that does not mean that's the end of participants. There should be ongoing treatment. There should be ongoing access to safe and effective vaccines if they are proven to be safe in the clinical trial. But obviously, within those issues, there were a lot of differences, also a lot of controversies with some disagreements or difference in views amongst RIC members themselves. So I'll just, for the sake of time, quickly highlight two of these. So one of them was the issue of including the so-called vulnerable populations in clinical trials. So particularly the issue of including or excluding pregnant women and children. There were a lot of vigorous discussions about how should RICs respond to proposals who, for example, want to recruit pregnant women in COVID-19 vaccine trials. What should their response be? Should they outrightly reject those proposals, or should there be other consideration that they should take in place to ensure that pregnant women and children also equally benefit from the potential of participating in COVID-19 trials. Lastly, another interesting issue was the issue of using biological samples from participants in these COVID-19 clinical trials. So there was a lot of discussion about what exactly is the acceptable type of consent when people are donating samples. And sometimes they are being asked to donate samples for research, for future research, which they do not know what it entails. So should RICs require specific consent? Should the consent be broad? Or should RICs have the right to waive a consent in that case? So these were some of the interesting controversial ethical issues that were discussed by RICs in the consultative workshop. So this is my last slide, and I'll be happy to take any questions in the preceding discussions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Blessing. Thank you for that. I think we'll move swiftly on to the question and answer session. We have one clarifying questions for Mantoa, and it's coming from Dando. He's saying, what does DAF stand for, and why does DAF have a role in approving investigational products? Is this not the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries role? So this is for Dr. Mahashani.
Yes, thank you. For instance, in the document that I was looking at, I didn't actually also follow up to find out why, because I asked myself that question. But I think it's because they're also involved in making sure that we get safe products in the country. But I don't know why specifically them, or was it maybe a typo in the doc? I'll need to check that.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Matthias. He's asking, amidst the urgency for COVID-19 vaccine, we begin to see kangaroo trials that are meandering through the conventional phases of clinical trials. What is the rationale for this state of affairs? How efficacious are such products coming out of this kangaroo arrangement? And what ethical issues does this arrangement bring on board versus the conventional way? So I'm thinking Matthias is asking specifically around, you know, some of the shortcuts that are being taken in the development of COVID-19 vaccine trials, that it's not clear the sequence of phases, you know, whether we go from phase 1, 2, 3, or whether we just jump straight into phase 3, and what are the ethical issues. I'll direct the question to Professor Bukusi if you have some thoughts on that.
Thank you for the question. I was actually wondering what he meant by kangaroo. So he's talking about shortcuts. Ideally, when an ethics review committee is looking at any clinical trial, they should look at the safety data. You should not be able to go to a phase 3 study if you haven't done a phase 2 and a phase 1, because it is important that you know that it is safe and that it doesn't cause harm before you can go ahead and then ensure that in the process of confirming that it is safe, you can now test, does it work? So there isn't any space for the kind of kangaroo trials, if that's what you're describing them as. And that is what review processes should do, ensure the safety of those individuals. There isn't anybody who we can say, this person isn't important enough. We can sacrifice them in the order to find what would help the greater public or the greater good. Every individual is important. That's why we talk about respecting the autonomy of the individual, allowing them to understand exactly what they're consenting for, but also ensuring that the science is sound before research is allowed.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bukusi, for that response. I'd like to take a moment to ask a question that was asked earlier before the webinar by a participant from Kenya. And they are asking, is there any Africa regional policy or guidelines on research ethics in Africa, or do we pretty much rely on the national research ethics guidelines? And perhaps I'll direct that one to Blessing, if you have any thoughts, Blessing.
Thanks, Yolanda. So if I understood the question, he's asking if there is an Africa-wide guideline, ethics guideline.
Yes, yes. So they're asking whether there's a guideline Africa-wide that countries can use for ethics review, or do they pretty much rely on local guidelines, national guidelines? And I'm thinking that you might be able to help us understand with the work that you do across Africa.
So there are some international guidelines. For example, the Declaration of Helsinki, the CIOMS guidelines. These are really international guidelines for general health-related research. But then most African countries have also developed their own local guidelines. For example, in South Africa, they have the Department of Health guidelines. In Kenya, they also have their own guidelines in Uganda, Zimbabwe. Most African countries really to date have now developed their own local guidelines. And some of those were adopted from the existing international guidelines, such as the Declaration of Helsinki that I just mentioned. But now particularly for epidemic research, as we saw with Ebola and now with COVID-19, we are saying there is no African-wide framework that supports, coherent review for these trials. And our work really particularly with the consultation of African regs was trying to say, could we potentially come up with a African-wide framework which helps RICs, in reviewing clinical trials in times of pandemics such as COVID-19 and Ebola.
Thank you, Blessing. There's another question. I'm not sure which country that comes from, but they're asking about ethics dumping and how ethics committees in Africa are mitigating against this ethics dumping, the concept of ethics dumping. It's not directed to any specific panelist. I wonder if there's anyone on the panel that is willing to respond to this.
Yeah, I mean, I could. It's really a concern. It's been a concern for quite some time now, where, for example, in the context of international collaborative research, where certain ethical standards that are not, for example, acceptable in the developed North are meant or are expected to be accepted in developing countries. But there have been steps that have been taken by African RICs or by African regulatory authorities in trying and strengthen their own local ethics regulatory frameworks to avoid or to minimize this concept of ethics dumping. So, for example, if you look at some of the issues that I highlighted in the first talk, one of the key concepts or one of the requirements is that any research before commencement should undergo independent ethics review by local ethics committees. And those are some of the measures precisely to ensure that there is no ethics dumping happening, because local ethics committees in Africa would do their own, independent ethics committee, and, for example, not just accept a proposal which has been, for example, approved in a developed country for research which is happening in a developing country. So it's something which, African RICs and regulatory authorities are really putting measures in place to ensure that it doesn't happen. I don't know if there's someone who wants to add on to that.
Thank you, Blessing, and I would like to add on to that. We usually actually try and find out where else the research is being done. Which countries globally is this research being done? So if it's not done anywhere, you just want to come and do it in our communities, we refuse. So we make sure that there's no dumping in our space. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think I might open it up for some questions to be asked by our advocates on the floor, if anyone would like to ask verbally.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yolanda. I do have a question for Professor Bukusi. What are your thoughts about the human challenge trials? For example, we're hearing currently in the UK, they will be injecting folks with coronavirus in place of the phase 3 trials so that they can test whether the vaccines are working. What are your thoughts around the human challenge trials, the ethical considerations around it?
I'm glad you're asking for my thoughts, because they will be purely that, my thoughts. From an ethical perspective, can one accept human challenge studies for a disease or a virus for which we have no known cure, no clear mitigation? We are uncertain about the course of events. We're still trying to find out what is it that predisposes some individuals to only have a mild infection that they shake off or not even be aware of, and others to get to the point where they require such critical care that they lose their lives. In the absence of being able to have clear data that tells you you can actually control it, the idea of human challenge to me becomes very, very scary. And indeed, what kind of information are you going to provide to an individual who is going to supposedly consent for that human challenge experiment, making it clear to them that you have minimal or limited opportunity to be able to reverse a process once it starts, or to be able to actually offer them care that would guarantee that they can come back to their normal life? I find it very, very difficult.
Yes,
Thank
could
you.
add to
Yes.
that? Sorry, it's Sarah here. Just from the perspective of the global north, there's been quite a lot of discussion, as you'll know, about human challenge studies to be done in the West. So there's already a huge enthusiasm for taking part, and lots of people have already registered their interest. And I think from the global north perspective, a lot of people are willing to take those risks, but if they regard themselves as being at low risk of having a severe condition, but also because some of the non-pharmaceutical measures that have been undertaken, such as lockdown, people have regarded as, for them, so far removed from what they regard as normal life, they would be prepared as if they were on a war footing. I mean, we make quite a lot of this sort of war analogy in the north, because we're not used to these kinds of emergencies that perhaps some countries in Africa really are. So, you know, Ebola, some of the endemic infectious diseases make the relative risks to do with COVID seem very different from how we see it affecting our normal lives in the northern countries. So I think that there may be a case for human challenge studies, but certainly not in those areas where COVID is prevalent, and where the research efficacy can be done ethically, without the need to expose otherwise healthy people to the risks of, you know, severe problematic conditions. But it's an evolving debate, but certainly there are quite a huge number of people certainly in the US and increasingly in the UK offering to volunteer their participation for such studies.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Sarah. We have a question from Mark. It's directed to Blessing. Blessing, please clarify the compromise on desire for pre-approval, and also share how far the issues from the consultation process have been taken up and implemented. Blessing?
So, yes, thanks, Yolanda. The issue of pre-approval.
Yes,
so it's
please clarify the compromise on the desire for pre-approval.
Yes, so it's one of the sort of topics that was also discussed in the consultative workshop that we had. I think generally there was a call for, particularly in epidemics such as Ebola and now COVID-19, there was a call for to have some sort of pre-approval process for clinical trials. And obviously, this call was as a result of the need to ensure that once we are in an epidemic, proposals can be implemented with speed. So if we have some sort of like a pre-approval process where certain aspects of the clinical trial proposals are approved in advance, and only when an epidemic happens, only a few remaining aspects can be clarified, but most of the work would have already been pre-approved. And obviously that's from the perspective of people advocating for such pre-approval protocols, is that it helps to speed up the review process, because there were a lot of complaints that sometimes getting approval, the normal approval process, takes a lot of time, and there is need to ensure that in an epidemic you also initiate clinical trials as speedily as possible. So this issue of pre-approval was something that was really called for by people who were saying, if we can have some sort of pre-approval process, it can really help to speed up the actual or the final approval of the proposal in an epidemic context. Then to the second question on where we are, so we did the first round of consultation, and we intended to do another round of consultation with RICs again and with a wider audience, but that is still, we're still finalizing the details, and we should be having another second round sometime soon.
Okay, thank you so much. Perhaps a question for John, who sits on the ethics committee representing communities. There's a question here that says some communities are already asking questions about access post-trials and receiving no answer. How can we address? John, any thoughts on this?
It's very important that in the engagement with the communities, and the researcher should be able to satisfy whether there will be post-trial access to the product being tested. In some cases, some researchers do their research, and after getting the results, they leave the communities without accessing the tested product. It is very, very important to engage the researchers when it comes to such a situation, especially when they are testing medicinal products. And the product should go to those who most need it. Those communities that have participated in the trial. Example is here in Africa. The trials that come for clinical trials which come to Africa, they come in stages of proving whether the product is working for, like they are at stage 3 of the trial, and they want to see how their product is working. But after proving that actually the product is working, the researchers must be engaged to ensure that there is post-trial access to these products.
Okay, thank you so much, John. I'm sorry to have to...
I would like to add that it is the responsibility of the ESCO committees to see that there is compliance with the protocol that was approved for trial. In most cases, when the research begins, it is left to the researcher, and nobody goes back to see whether they are complying with the protocol that was submitted. But here in Uganda, some IRCs are trying to see that they do site monitoring visits. Like here at UVRI, we do those site monitoring visits to see whether there is compliance with the submitted protocol.
Okay, thank you so much, John. I'm so sorry to have to cut you off there. I realize we're running out of time. But to take this opportunity to thank our panelists for a very informative session today, and also to make a request to all the participants today, if there's anything that we haven't covered today that you would like us to maybe do another webinar to cover some of the topics, please do send us a note, or send it via email or via chat on this platform. And there's also a course from our partners on understanding the ethics processes that you can also visit the Engage platform if you want to learn more about ethics processes. So thank you very much, everyone. I know we've run out of time. We would have liked to cover a lot of questions. We'll be sharing a Q&A document with responses to all the questions that have been asked prior, and some that we haven't been able to cover during today's session. So thank you so much. And I don't know if my colleagues would also like to say something before we close. Kathy, Meliswa, Ethel?
Well, just thank you very much for their participation and questions. I feel like we just went to the tip of the iceberg, but we're very grateful for everyone's question and engagement.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So I think we'll close it here and have a good afternoon.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Do feel
Thank you very much.
Anybody who wants to pick up questions later.
So I've posted my email address and Yolanda's email address in the chat. And I think also in the invitations that you received from the Zoom webinar, you'll be able to send an email with your questions directly to any of us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.